Welcome back to VADA Live. I'm your host, Dan Carrigan. As we approach the 1-year anniversary of VADA Live, we are super excited. We found it fitting to welcome back our very first guest. And that's Brian Finkelmeyer, Senior Director of Enterprise Insights and Advisory at Cox Automotive. Of course, Brian being the first guest, also having him on this time of year, at a time of recording, is really, really important. And Brian, your insights into the market have really long helped dealers anticipate trends, adapt with confidence, and let's just catch up on what's new, what's tracking. There's a lot of news and things to get to, and what themes you're expecting for 2026. And we can hear a little more from Cox Automotive and what's new there. Brian, welcome back to VADA Live.
Dan, it's great to be here, and it's hard to believe it's been a year since we last spoke, and so much has transpired. I don't know if we'll be able to get that all packed in during the conversation.
We'll see what we can do, Brian. If you're game for doing that, we'll try our best. And it's one of those things where it feels like we have chatted yesterday, but then if you look back in news cycle and everything going on, it's, oh my gosh, it's been longer than a calendar year, feels like. Your party crasher theme, which you would share during our call, and that was part of your talk during the convention a year ago. Can we get an update there? Where does that stand now? Are there any new crashers?
Well, I guess I owe everybody a big apology. I missed the biggest party crasher of them all, was the tariffs that were announced back on early April that I think flipped the industry upside down. I don't know that any of us last year foresaw that happening, and it's had a pretty dramatic impact, certainly on the automakers. You know, we've estimated that the global profit hit to automakers is somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 billion so far this year. So pretty massive change to their business, as well as the change with the big, beautiful bill shut down a lot of the emissions targets and a lot of the penalties that the car manufacturers thought they were going to face on that side of the fence. So, you know, I'd done an article back earlier this year saying that politicians are treating the auto industry like a piñata, and each party is kind of coming at them from a different standpoint. So I certainly feel sympathetic to the plight of the automakers here as they try to navigate these very turbulent external forces that largely outside their control. But I think through the lens of, you know, the consumer and the dealer, you know, it's interesting to see that despite these tariffs and whatnot, the industry is up 3%. Sales-wise, we have seen a little bit of softening here recently, but I think on the net, you know, car dealers' profitability still remains strong, and the American consumer, despite some significant financial headwinds, you know, we're still going to probably have a very solid new car sales year of upwards of high 15.7 to 16 million.
How should dealers feel about that, looking at the current market? Really, what jumps out to you as far as performance, inventory, and trends as we close out 2025? Where should their thoughts be? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I'm keeping a close eye on a couple of different things, one of which is, you know, new car inventories have now hit about 3 million units across the nation, and that is definitely an uptick. You know, down during the microchip shortage, we gotten down to maybe 600,000 units of dealer inventory. So we've more or less gotten back to kind of a more normalized inventory situation. And what we're seeing here recently is just that car manufacturers, and I think it's in direct response to this financial pressure they're feeling on the tariff side, they begin ratcheting back their incentives. And we have been running at about 7.5% incentive as a percent of the selling price of the vehicle. This last month of October, we got down to 6.5, which is about the lowest level of what we had seen since around 2022. So I think this is a sign to say that automakers are trying to figure out this balance of, you know, maintaining their wholesale, but trying to be conservative on the margin side with the incentives as they are offsetting these costs of the tariffs. So I think that's one of the key things that I'm certainly keeping an eye on.
Affordability, that was a mentioned party crasher. What challenges ending the year going into next, and how might that shape it?
Well, I think this affordability question is almost perplexing in some ways. And what I mean by that is that, you know, if you look at, it is true that new car selling prices have now in September, exceeded $50,000 for the first time ever. So the average selling price of a new car crested over $50,000 in the first year of Kelley Blue Book's 100-year history. So it was a very notable thing this last month. It dipped just below $50,000. So vehicles are clearly very expensive. It's also true that new car interest rates on loans, the blended average across all credit tiers right now is running about 9.5%. So money is not cheap. And I think average new car prices are upwards of $780 a month for the new car buyer. So from that standpoint, no doubt there are affordability challenges. But it's also true that, in some of these segments like compact sedans, or mid-size sedans where you can find more affordable transportation, the Hyundai Elantra today is sitting at a 111-day supply. Or I should say the Hyundai Sonata. The Elantra is at about a 77-day supply. And I just find that kind of peculiar to me that as Americans are feeling financial pressure, there are some economical, fuel-efficient vehicles and vehicles that have healthy incentives and are less expensive than these trucks and SUVs. But it just goes to show you Americans have just really kind of abandoned the sedans. In fact, sedan sales in that mid-size sedan segment that used to always be the Accord and the Camry, always number 1 and 2 sellers in America. I mean, sedan sales were down 22% in that mid-size sedan segment. So that's what's kind of peculiar to me is, yes, it's true. Americans are feeling financial pressure, looking for affordable transportation, while simultaneously avoiding some of the most affordable segments in the industry.
You mentioned that's perplexing. Can I ask why you think that is the case? Best guess there?
Well, I guess, my best guess is just to say that auto buyers just do not want sedans anymore. And they're willing to say, well, I'll go buy a used SUV as a more desirable outcome than to buy a brand new 50 mile per gallon Honda Civic. Which I just find that to be, that's why I'm saying it's peculiar to me, is there are affordable options out there, but largely American consumers are not gravitating to those cars. And in fact, I have to say, about a year and a half ago, I bought a new vehicle myself, and I bought a sedan. I must feel like a dinosaur because when I pull into a parking lot, I'm like the only guy that drives a sedan anymore. So it just speaks to the changing preferences of the American consumer as no longer a sedan market, that's for sure.
And may I complicate this discussion a bit and ask about EVs within that too?
Yeah, I mean, the EV situation, so much of this that was driven based on, I would say, not consumer demand, but really government intervention with these incentives. And we're going to get, and my point or my opinion, I think, is going to be proved in pretty short order as we begin to see just this massive drop off in EV sales that is going to transpire over the next 6 to 12 months. And so what we all saw was that in September and then into October, there was this huge ramp up, or I should say that the end of September was the end, September 30th, the end of the EV tax incentive of $7,500. We saw a big uptick in terms of EV volume. We saw plug-in volume, all this kind of unnatural demand that was driven largely by incentives. And now that has been sunset, I think we're going to see a more normalized demand situation for EVs. And largely, I think the American consumer and most swaths of America, certainly in some of the coastal markets, you saw more of a higher penetration of the EVs. But in the middle of America, this is almost a non-starter. And so, one of the things that I found to be very interesting is that, our friend Elon Musk over there at Tesla, they've now actually started a short-term rental program where you can go to a Tesla dealership and actually rent cars as more of a long-term test drive, I guess they're calling it. And I would say that is certainly a byproduct of them losing out on the 7,500. I see that as a tactic that they're taking to try to drive traffic and generate more interest and demand in their vehicles.
One area I want to dive into, Brian, and you mentioned some skewing a used SUV, question being the new versus used mix. Where do you see that playing out in the short and long term?
Well, I mean, used cars, still remain elevated, not quite as crazy as it was a couple of years ago. The Manheim Used vehicle market index is running around 145 today. I think more historics in the 100 to 110. So we're still in an elevated used car market. And I think one of the big challenges that dealers across America continue to face is just that used car acquisition has been such an issue because, leasing was such a built-in annuity where these leases were coming back every 3 years, and there were millions of cars coming back of off-lease vehicles that made for beautiful used car acquisition, where dealers did not have to go out and pay top dollar at auction. They were able to feed their CPO and used car departments with off-lease. Well, 2025 really marks the absolute bottom valley of lease turn-ins. And so just to put that in perspective, most year the industry would see north of 4 million lease turn-ins. I think this year it's maybe 2 million. It's like half. And so that's put a lot of pressure on dealers to figure out new ways to acquire vehicles because they lost this beautiful annuity that was kind of an automatic source of used car inventory for their operations.
Yeah, Brian, and midway through this discussion, if I can throw in a bit of an inflection point, all these things considered, what do you think this means for 2026 for consumers, dealers, automakers? If we were working on a headline, what do you think that would be at this point?
Well, I think the headline is just to keep your head screwed on straight because we have no idea what's going to happen next, right? I mean, the last 5 years has been like this roller coaster of unexpected twists and turns and upside downs and all arounds. It's been just a crazy industry. I think about my entire career in the auto industry. We've seen more in the last couple of years than I'd seen the first 25 years. So I would say that through the lens of the automaker, starting there, I think the big question is what the Supreme Court rules with respect to Trump and the tariffs. If that is unwound, I think that's going to certainly provide some breathing room financially for the car companies and make them feel a whole lot better about things. I think through the lens of the dealer, they've continued to, even though volumes have come down, I think their margins are definitely down from these elevated levels that they got to enjoy during the microchip shortage and the pandemic, where they kind of had the golden era of the retail car business. But on a relative basis, we're still doing much better today than we were in 2019. We're making more money in F&I. Margins are higher. Quite frankly, this richer mix of bigger SUVs and more expensive trucks lends itself to bigger margins. So I think from the lens of the dealer, life is going to remain, for the most part, pretty solid. And I would feel good about being a car dealer. But I think the last question you have is just the consumer. And I think on the consumer piece, there's really almost two Americas emerging. And one America is, 10% of American citizens own 90% of the stocks. And so, those of us that have been investors in the stock market have enjoyed just insane portfolio growth over the last 5 years. And so that America feels very good about going out and buying new Lexuses and BMWs and, buying new cars. And it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? Like, life is very good, but that's for the top 10% of this country. The other 90% of this country, I think, is feeling the brunt of this inflationary prices on groceries, on just mainstay durable goods. And what we've seen that's really interesting is the University of Michigan does this consumer sentiment study. Every month they update this. And in the month of October, we hit one of the lowest marks that they've seen in that consumer sentiment in a long time. And in fact, that was down 30% year on year. And I think that speaks to this growing economic pressure that American households are feeling. And not to, make anyone on this podcast feel bad about things, but one of the other dynamics we're seeing is just a big uptick in delinquencies on credit card debt and revolving debt of consumers. So I think we're kind of in this scenario of two Americas, and on the one hand of the ledger, you have these very affluent households that are doing well, and those households are really driving the car market with these average MSRPs over $50,000. And then you have this other 90% of America that I think is feeling economic pressure, which is going to make it a lot more difficult to spend $780 on a new vehicle purchase payment.
Anything dealers hearing this could do or react to, acknowledging that there's a delta between those two customer bases?
Well, certainly, I think this has to shape and inform your marketing is a big piece of this. And then I think the other thing is that, those families in the top 10%, they're used to certain experiences. They don't shop at JCPenney. They shop at Nordstrom. They don't shop, and so what are we doing from an experience perspective? And this is the age-old conversation we've been having forever in the car business, but it's so true, is are we connecting with that higher educated, higher income? Are we meeting those people where they want to be met? And, one of the big things that we've been working on over the past couple of years at Cox Automotive is really this concept of retail 360. The buzzword is omni-channel purchase experience, where consumers are able to complete some of that process or some of their purchase process online and then complete other steps of that in the dealership. And one of the big detractors to customer satisfaction is if I've already provided my credit stuff, I've already provided my trade-in, I've already done all this work, and then I walk into the dealership. If you make me start at square one, I'm not going to be very pleased with that purchase experience. So I would say, just the last comment, there's no doubt that the faster we can get people in and out of the process, the better. And so I think, just to reiterate my point, let's be honest, a growing percentage of your new car customers are people that make over $250,000 a year, quite frankly. And are we elevating our service game to match the experiences that those people are used to having in other facets of their life?
One quick programming note. Brian and I are talking in mid-November as we go through the predictions, knowing that things can change by the day. And Brian, it would appear that we just opened the door to talk about AI. When we're going through marketing and customer experience, it really, and we had done a special series for VADA Live, just options, insights, varying degrees for dealers, news they can really use. Anything realistic or from your side they can expect for the next year? Where should dealers tread carefully with AI, especially through that lens of the customer experience?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. And, as we look not just in the auto industry, but across America, it's a real dilemma and a question, because I think that there's like some clear examples of where AI can help drive efficiency and below the surface cost savings of doing things. Theoretically, there's a lot of promise around this, but I think there has been some examples that people have been able to describe or demonstrate where we're saving money below the line. The $1 million question, though, is how does AI get used to deliver increased, profits and increased sales and increased revenues above the line? And I think that's like, the $100 billion question is how is that going to happen? I would say that, today what we're talking about is like, well, we can do chat bots that can interact with consumers more effectively. I guess, is that an efficiency play? Maybe. We've had chat bots for a while. We can help write better emails. We can, these personalized messaging things with AI. I don't know that I believe that that's going to drive like a 15% growth, and we're going to take the TIV from 17 million, from 15 million to 17 million because we're writing AI emails. Like I would say that I'm not subscribing to that. But I would say my thought to the dealer would be to say, there's a lot of people out there selling magic bullets right now. And so I would be reluctant. My dad used to tell me anytime something seems too good to be true, it normally is. And so I would be sort of conservative about my testing of these things. But we can't deny it's coming. It's happening. We're using this in our daily lives. And I'm sure that there's going to be, in the next coming years, some really smart, creative people that figure out how do we do a better job at driving efficiency below the line? How do we use AI to drive more sales and revenue on the top of the line? And I hope to have a front row seat to see how that all plays out.
Brian, as one final question, what's your number one message to dealers as they plan for 2026?
Yeah, I think my message is, obviously blocking and tackling has been a tried and true method to success in the car business. I think it's going to continue to be a tried and true method. And, what's just so impressive to me about the auto industry is over the last few years, as I mentioned, the roller coaster ride that none of us could have predicted. And I suspect that there's a couple more twists and turns that we haven't even begun to contemplate. And the industry's overall resilience amidst these massive external forces, and that cuts across to both dealers as well as automakers. And this industry's ability to persevere through really significant headwinds. And I would argue that our industry has faced more headwinds than maybe any other major industry across the United States economic landscape. And for this industry to keep banging out 15, 16 million, car dealers are making money. I continue to wake up every morning being fortunate that I chose this career in the car business, because it's such an amazing business to be a part of. And all of us that are a part of this should consider ourselves very lucky.
You've been hearing from Brian Finkelmeyer, Senior Director of Enterprise Insights and Advisory at Cox Automotive, back to help us celebrate 1 year of VADA Live. As our first guest, we appreciate you, Brian, showing back up for VADA Live to gather insights and share predictions, perhaps what to prepare for, and the road ahead for 2026. We appreciate you watching VADA Live. I'm your host, Dan Carrigan. We hope to see you next time.